On December 30th, 1999, an intruder broke into George Harrison's home at Friar Park and attacked him at about 3 a.m. And by the time it was over, George was laying on the floor after being stabbed 41 times. Just a horrible, horrible event. I'd heard about this before, but I'd never heard the details until I was recently reading this book. It's Eric Idle's biography, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Monty Python fans will love this. It's funny and witty. It's everything great about Eric Idle. But if you're not a Python fan, but you dig George Harrison, you should pick up a copy, because his stories about his friendship with George are really, really beautiful. He starts out by talking about how they met. He had heard George Harrison was a big Monty Python fan. Eric was at a screening, Holy Grail, and he had heard that George was going to show up, and he was really intimidated, was afraid to meet him. The story he had heard was there was a Python sketch about an actor being busted, and George loved it because he thought that it was about his drug bust. So Eric Idle goes into the back of the theater to just kind of hide because he was afraid to meet George Harrison. And George Harrison had some tenacity, and he hunted him down and started chatting him up and said, it's too loud to talk here. Let's go up into the projection booth and have a reefer. So they walk into the projection booth, and imagine there's a guy running the projector, and in walks George Harrison and Eric Idle and just start talking about whatever. Lots of beautiful stories. He goes into detail about how the life of Brian would not have been made if George didn't step up and lend him the money. And just sounds like a beautiful, beautiful friendship. And George Harrison just wanted that to be out into the world. Lots of wonderful talks about fame and how useless that George Harrison thought it was. Where he's saying that if most people were rich and famous, and then they could choose just one, they'd probably just take the rich and leave the famous behind. And just beautiful observations, including roping in Bob Dylan into some of those stories. But the craziest story of all is the account of the attack. And there's a 34-year-old man who was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. And the police report said that he had delusions of divinity and belief that Harrison was the Antichrist. And he broke in at 3:30 a.m. George Harrison had problems with stalkers. You can imagine, if you're a Beatle, what you might deal with through life. And he'd beefed up security all over Friar Park, and just a beautiful estate, in a crazy looking mansion. He put up wire fences and hired extra people, got guard dogs to roam the property, but somehow this guy scaled the fence, and they woke up to a window breaking downstairs. So Eric Idle was out of the country when he heard about the attack, and he called George after George got out of the hospital. He says, "Hey, I'm out of the country, but would you like me to come over?" And he says, "Yeah." And he grabbed the first plane, and I'm just going to read from Eric Idle here. He says, "We were relieved to find them alive. We kept thinking we could so easily have been flying for their funeral, but mercifully they were home, though bruised, wounded, and shocked. George had 7 stab wounds, which he displayed rolling up his shirt. Some wounds were exit wounds, where the blade had simply gone right through him. One stab had punctured and collapsed his lung, leaving him dangerously short of breath, lying on the floor, chanting while his lung filled up with blood." George says, "I thought I was dead, Eric." So I'll continue with Eric Idle's account, told to him by George Harrison. He says, "It was the ultimate nightmare, an armed intruder in your home at 3:30 in the morning, breaking windows and screaming loudly at you to come down. I wrestled hand to hand with the face of evil for 15 minutes, said George. 15 minutes is an awfully long time to struggle for your life against a man with a 7-inch kitchen knife while receiving multiple stab wounds. He came racing up the stairs, screaming dementedly. Having called the police, Olivia ran out with a poker to find her husband on the ground and a man attempting to kill him. She bashed the intruder on the head 15 times with the poker, but amazingly, he was able to get up and turn on her. He knocked her over, and she lost the poker and retreated to the bedroom, where he followed her. Although stabbed by then, George was able to get up and go to her aid, at which point Olivia picked up a huge Tiffany lamp and began to bash the man about the head. It was like a movie, she said. He wouldn't stop. There was blood everywhere. I kept yelling at him to stop, but he'd just get up again. He grabbed the cord of the lamp and came at her with it. I thought he was going to strangle me, she said. She knew there was another heavier poker by the fireplace and ran downstairs. He meanwhile picked up the lamp and began to beat George with it. George says I'd had it by then. I just tried to put my feet up to stop him. But George had taken several blows to the head. Then Olivia heard the man coming after her. She felt she could outrun him, but to her relief, she heard him suddenly collapse. All his head wounds had finally caught up with him. Later, to his great joy, George learned that she'd managed to stab him in the butt. He was to have 22 stitches in his head, a measure of the success of Olivia, but right now there were three totally exhausted combatants. The battle was over. George was lying upstairs, desperately wounded, his lungs filling with blood, chanting Hare Krishna. The intruder was collapsed on their balcony, and Olivia was sprawled at the foot of the stairs as the police entered. It was a scene from a horror movie. Blood was everywhere. Danny, their 21-year-old son, was faced with this dreadful scene. He kept his father conscious during the long wait until the ambulance came. He could always be proud of this, but no son should have to face what Danny had to face. Eric Idle says, by the time Tanya and I arrived at Friar Park, George and Liv were patched up but angry, like all victims of violent crime, and in need of good friendship. Nobody had more good friends all around the world, and flowers and faxes poured in. We played guitars and sang. George was very shaken. I'd never seen him like this. He needed constant hugs. Just a horrible, horrible thing for anybody to have to live through, but there's much more to the account than what I've read here. I urge everybody to pick up a copy and read it. It's a beautiful testimony to their friendship. It hit me pretty hard the first time I read that, the account of George laying on the floor, thinking that it was over, and chanting Hare Krishna. That stuck with me. It's a testament to his faith. There's a sign, a quote up in the Liverpool airport that I saw trying to catch a flight maybe 15 years ago. Something to the effect of the Beatles had more money than God, all the fame and everything, but it's completely worthless if you don't have your health. And maybe I'll stick that on the screen if I can find the exact quote. But it was, perfect George. So I was fortunate enough to get to interview and strike up a friendship with a man named Kevin Harrington. He worked for the Beatles, kind of a roadie. He's the guy who carried all of the equipment up to the roof when they played on the rooftop. He's the redheaded kid who's holding the lyrics for John Lennon. You've seen him in a lot of pictures. Just a beautiful, beautiful cat. But he lived with George at Friar Park for a while and has some great stories about it. And I interviewed him in Milton Keynes, England a couple years ago. I'm going to link that right here. I hope you guys will watch it. It's really good stuff. And I will see you guys somewhere down the road. Much love to you.